Right, good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Jonathan Wilson, and this is the guest lecture on Is Print Media Advertising Dead? So this is a session that I delivered earlier in the week, face-to-face. So if you are learning remotely, or perhaps if you were unable to attend the face-to-face session, you're very welcome, of course, to have a look through the recording. This will be a slightly more condensed version of what I covered earlier in the week, which will cover the key points from the session. So the slides are exactly the same, but I'm covering the key content. So the structure of the session is as follows. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about my own media journey, working in print media. Secondly, we'll look at advertising spend in the UK. So it's very much a UK focus in terms of advertising. Thirdly, what is print media advertising? And that looks at how do we actually define it? What does it mean in principle? And then after that, we'll look at print media and how it compares to other types of media. For example, looking at radio, TV, and also digital. Then towards the end, we'll look at trends in print media. And then what I want you to do is all the way through think about this question, is print media advertising dead? And then at the end of the session, we'll draw some conclusions and see if we can answer this particular question. Okay, so there are a few Mentimeter questions. For those of you who are listening to this recording, we won't actually do the Mentimeter questions, but you can still have a go at thinking about and answering the question. So the first question is quite simple, and that is, do you buy a daily newspaper, excuse me, or do you subscribe to a magazine? So I'll give you a moment, and it might be a simple yes, of course, or a simple no answer. Okay, if you answered no to this particular question, then you are in keeping with those students that attended the face-to-face session, because every single student actually said that the answer is no, they do not buy a daily newspaper or subscribe to a magazine. And that is unsurprising, because research does show that typically certain age groups, particularly those of a more younger age group, tend not to subscribe to a particular paper or a magazine. A lot of their news content, for example, they will get from social media, certainly digital, as opposed to more traditional media such as a newspaper. However, we look at older demographics such as baby boomers. Many of those do still buy a daily newspaper or a particular magazine. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own media journey. So before I worked in academia, so this is going back 20 years or so now, I worked for a national newspaper, and I was here. So I don't know if you know this building. This building is Canary Wharf Tower, which is in Docklands in London, and I worked on the 19th floor. So on the 19th floor, we had the Independent newspaper, which is where I worked, the Independent on Sunday. We also had Mirror Group newspapers, so that's the Daily Mirror. And in the same building also was the Telegraph Group, so that's the Daily Telegraph and the Sunday Telegraph. So it was a nice place to work, very, very good view of London, I can tell you, from the 19th floor, and also from the River Thames as well. So I don't know how much you know about the Independent. The newspaper itself was established in 1986, largely in response to the nature of the newspaper market at the time. So it was viewed that there was a gap in the market for a sort of independent left of centre newspaper. And the team that set up the newspaper, one of the key people was a chap called Tony O'Reilly, who used to be the CEO of Heinz Baked Beans. And they set up the newspaper, again, largely because of this gap in the market. In the early stages, it was quite successful. But one of the problems the Independent did face was that it was trying to play catch up with other newspapers that were much more established, such as the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, that I'm sure you know. And also, as we can see here, there's a shift towards digital. So about 10 years or so ago now, the newspaper decided to become a digital only format. And one of the reasons for this is because, of course, the internet was becoming much more popular, but also the circulation took a massive decline. So that's the number of people that buy the newspaper was only around about 58 to 60,000. Okay, so 58 to 60,000 is very, very low. When I worked at the newspaper, at its peak, it was around about 285 to 290,000. So a massive drop in newspaper sales. So as you can see here, that's why they eventually moved to digital format. And sorry, I think this other slide. Okay, for some reason, Blackboard is not showing this slide, which I can talk about, which just shows you the number of users now, or the number of unique users that visit the website, which runs into millions. So it's much more successful, the digital site, when we compare it to the traditional newspaper, based on a number of different metrics. So apologies that I don't know why that slide's not showing up, but you will be able to see it when I upload the slides to Blackboard. Another key feature of the Independent, and not just the Independent, but all newspapers really, is the relationship between journalism and advertising. So this chap here is called Simon Calder. Some of you may know Simon. He's the travel editor for the Independent. He's also on television quite a lot, particularly when there's a problem to do with travel, such as flights are delayed. He's been on the TV quite a lot recently with the P&O Ferries redundancy scandal. And when I was at the Independent, Simon was also there, and occasionally we would work together. So advertising would work with journalists to produce something like this. So what we've got here is an article on Belize as a tourist destination. So someone like Simon would write the article, and then you'll notice we've got advertisements here in the bottom corner. So although this looks like a normal or typical newspaper article, it's actually what we call advertorial rather than editorial. So we've got an editorial piece and we've got advertising alongside it. So the purpose of advertorial is often a journalist will write about, in this case, Belize, what a wonderful place Belize is as a destination. If you read the article, perhaps you've got aspirations to visit Belize, and then you've got advertisements here at the bottom that can, fulfill that intention. The other thing about advertorial is often it is paid for by the advertisers. So in this case, the article on Belize could well have been paid for by perhaps one, if not probably all of these advertisers here. So the advantage to the advertiser is that it can really help to generate interest and generate sales. It's also advantageous for the newspaper as well, because usually it's a topical piece, it's an interesting piece, and one would hope it's of interest to the reader as well. Oh, that's the slide I wanted. So we can see here when we look at unique browsers and page impressions, both daily and monthly, how impressive that is when we compare to that 58,000 figure for the print version. What we've got here is just over 3.5 million daily average unique browsers, which is audited by an organization called ABC. So ABC stands for the Audit Bureau of Circulation. So they cover all both magazines and newspapers in the UK. And if you want to find out circulation figures, ABC is the organization that records those and has data on that information as well. So you can see, since they've moved to digital, the Independent has certainly been successful, and I think it's been a good move in their particular case to go to fully digital. This slide just shows you some of the main competitors. So the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian. The Observer is another newspaper, which is a Sunday publication. we also had the Sunday Independent as well, so that was a direct competitor. And one of the problems I found when I worked at the newspaper is that because the Independent was quite late, or very late actually, to the market compared to these newspapers, it was trying to play catch up. So these newspapers have very, very established readership, and essentially the Independent was the fourth player in the market. All right, so you've got Telegraph, Times, Guardian, Independent. So in terms of advertising, at times it's quite challenging to win new clients and to encourage organizations to advertise with you, because we had a lower circulation than something like the Telegraph, which is around about 1 million circulation. As I said, we're about 285 to 290, so a much smaller audience. Another question on advertising spend in the UK. So this particular question looked at where does advertising spend go, and in terms of different types, or by medium, I should say. And this chart shows you from 2012 to 2024. So these last couple of years, or 3 years actually, projections. And the question asked to students is to rank in order each medium based on advertising spend. And I think most students got this correct. So maybe unsurprisingly, the majority of spend goes on what's called pure play internet, which is exclusively internet advertising. And that's over 16 billion pounds. Secondly is TV. News brands, that would include the likes of the Telegraph, the Mirror. Then we've got outdoor, radio, magazines, and cinema. So of course we need to factor in the pandemic. So if you look at 2020, that's really not a good year at all for cinema, which is unsurprising because many cinemas were closed because of the pandemic. Radio is still a popular medium because it's convenient. Of course, we can listen to it in the car, at leisure, and it's very, very versatile in that respect. But as I said, the top three, most students I think got the correct order, which is pure play internet, TV, and news brands. Another question I asked is, where do UK supermarkets place the majority of their advertising spend? All right, so you may want to have a little think about this before you fire off your answer. So again, think about different media: radio, TV, internet, outdoor, cinema. Okay, and this slide from Mintel just shows you the breakdown. So above the line, which includes TV, radio, mass audience type media. TV at 43% actually is the favoured choice, and this is where the majority of advertising spend goes, which is, I know it's surprising, it was surprising to some students, but when you think about it, as a medium, TV can work particularly well for supermarkets, particularly in the run up to Christmas, so seasonal campaigns, thinking of the John Lewis ad, for example, Easter, of course, but also many supermarkets advertise regularly, and if you want to target a mass audience, and then TV can work particularly well. Also, press is quite high at 23%. Digital, perhaps we might think that's quite low. Direct mail and door drops, possibly this is very low, largely due to typically low response rate and targeting. That there can be targeting issues with these two examples. So this is specifically supermarkets. And I said most of this presentation is on the UK, but this slide is actually on the US. So here we've got the US total media ad spending share by media. And you can spend a moment or two looking at this table and looking at what the trend actually is in terms of print, and it's not very good. All right, so we can see that there's a decline from 9% down to about 5.5% for 2020, a similar decline from just over 8% to just over 5.5% for magazines. So going back to the question, is print media advertising dead? this doesn't really help. My argument that I don't think it is dead, because there is clearly a decline when we look at the US, both for newspapers and for magazines. So what is print media advertising? Quite simply, print media advertising is using hard copy format. So an example of that would be a glossy magazine. It would be a newspaper, and with hard copy tangible format, the written word is printed on usually paper, of course, and that could be glossy. It might be a glossy magazine, or it could be a typical newspaper, and different sizes are used. So for newspapers, we have something called a tabloid format, which is typically, of course, it's smaller. It has a certain number of columns, and we'll look at columns a bit later on. And then we have the broadsheet, which is bigger. So something like the Telegraph newspaper is a broadsheet, and the Sun, for example, is a tabloid newspaper. A couple of really important words or terms in newspaper and magazine advertising is circulation and readership. Okay, so if you work for a newspaper and somebody phoned you up and said to you, "Can you tell me your circulation, please?" All we're looking at here is the count, or the number of copies sold. All right, so circulation figure of 100,000, for example, is 100,000 publications sold. Not to be confused with readership. So readership is the number of readers that read the publication. So for example, you could sell 100,000 newspapers, but there may be 200,000 people that read the newspaper because they get passed on. And you'll see in a moment how readership could potentially be very high. They get passed on maybe to other family members or friends. So more than one person reads a publication. And these two figures are important because very often the price you pay for advertising is linked to the number of readers, the circulation, and or the readership. If we look at a couple of examples, I don't know if you're familiar with these two publications. The first one is Reader's Digest, which is a magazine, and the second one in London, the evening newspaper, is called the London Evening Standard. And the question is, what is special about these two publications? You can have a think. So you might not be familiar with both, but if you're familiar with one, you can have a think about what's special about the publication. Well, I can tell you that both of them have quite high circulation. So the Evening Standard it fluctuates, but usually around about 300,000. Reader's Digest is several hundred thousand, but what's absolutely key is the readership is very high. And the reason it's high for the London Evening Standard is because the newspaper is free and it often gets left on the Underground or the Tube. So if you read the London Evening Standard, someone may have left it on their seat, somebody else gets on the Tube, reads the newspaper. So you might find that as many as 6, 7 or 8 people read the one or the same newspaper. Similarly, with Reader's Digest, Reader's Digest is often left in waiting rooms. So for example, a dentist's waiting room, a doctor's waiting room, and of course in a waiting room a number of people sit down, they'll pick it up, they'll read it. So just looking at circulation is a little bit simplistic. If we're thinking about advertising spend, we also need to think about readership as well. And this slide just clearly illustrates what I've just mentioned. All right, so what we've got here is different publications across the bottom, and each bar represents the number of readers per copy. So you'll see What Car magazine has 9 readers per copy, which is very high. And if you think about the nature of a car magazine, again, that's the type of publication that perhaps is left in waiting rooms. If you go to a car dealership, it could be on the table, you could pick it up and read it. It could be left in libraries. So similarly with mother and baby, it could be left a nursery group or nursery waiting area, doctor surgery waiting room. Again, this is why there are high readership figures for these publications. And then we get onto something called, okay, again, Blackboard is playing up a little bit. Never mind, I can remember what the slide is, so I can tell you. And the full slide will be on Blackboard as uploaded. So one of the things to think about with advertising is the type of campaign that you might do. So we have something called a burst campaign, we have a drip campaign, and we have a pure campaign. So so I'm just seeing if that slide does. No, it's not coming up for some reason. Never mind. So first of all, a burst campaign. This is where an advertiser places the vast majority of their advertising budget over a short period of time. So for example, if you've got a new product, maybe coming out at Christmas, you want to get maximum coverage. So the vast majority of the budget will go on that particular short time frame. So a good example of this in the UK is a company called ITV Digital. So when ITV Digital launched in the early 2000s, the vast majority of their advertising spend was on TV advertising. They booked largely the whole day for TV advertising. It wasn't a very successful strategy because, of course, over time people soon forget, didn't really engage. The advert wasn't particularly good because it wasn't informative. It didn't tell you how you could buy ITV Digital, how you could subscribe. So a burst campaign really works if it's something new, and perhaps you want to educate the audience. That might be a successful strategy. Conversely, a drip campaign is where you stagger your advertising spend. All right, so you may want to familiarize the audience about a product on a regular basis. So supermarket advertising is perhaps a good example of this, a drip campaign, or maybe an insurance company like Churchill, or financial services. And the hybrid of the two is a pure strategy where you advertise at increments, so maybe every fortnight or every few weeks. Again, the purpose is to try and keep the product or the service at the forefront of someone's mind. But unlike burst, of course, it doesn't have the maximum, perhaps the maximum benefit that it could do, because you're staggering over a longer period of time. So when we think about advertising campaigns in terms of time frame, it's burst, it's drip, and it's the pure campaign, which tends to be less used less often compared to the other two. We can also distinguish advertising on the basis of display and classified. All right, so if you picked up a Sunday newspaper, for example, you might see an advert that looks like this. So this is for Volvo. Clearly, it's a car ad, and often car ads tend to be color, particularly in press. And what we mean by display advertising, the main characteristic is that you tend to get color visual type adverts, but they don't have a heading. All right, so there's no heading here that says car. We can see that from the advert. The other interesting thing is that, excuse me, although this is print media, we have at the bottom here a reference to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So it's a good example of how communications, the mix, uses traditional print media together with digital or social media in this case. So, you know, if you like the look of the Volvo car, you can go onto a Twitter site, for example, or YouTube, to have a look at the car in terms of a video, which might be interactive. So display advertising can be very, very expensive, and we'll look at the price of advertising a bit later. The other one is classified. So this is very much evident in a local newspaper. The key difference being here that you'll have a heading. You'll notice that there's no visual, it's all text. So if you want to advertise something like gardening services or building services, what you pay is usually priced per word, and it's much more inexpensive when we compare it to display advertising. So how a company decides what to use really does depend on the type of product, the service, the audience that they aim to appeal to. Usually big brands like Volvo, IKEA, BA, they'll use display. Local companies, small, medium-sized companies, if they're using their local paper, will use classified advertising. Something else that impacts the advertising rates, and is important in terms of audience is the socioeconomic scale. So this goes from A through to E. Now, if we look at something like the Financial Times, that's renowned for having a very, very high A-B readership. So what that means is that most people that read the Financial Times, they work in banking, they work in finance, they're in senior positions. So that's very attractive for companies that are trying to appeal to that particular audience, such as luxury car brands, fashion, companies like Rolex, Burberry. The Financial Times has what we call an A-B readership of around about 90%, which is very, very high. So although it may not have as many readers as something like the Sun newspaper, it's an attractive audience. Around about 180,000 people read the Financial Times. So of those, many of them are in the AB category. Again, another question. This is for you to think about, and it's a question I asked earlier in the week. So how much do you think a front page color ad, so we're talking to a half page color, and the Financial Times costs? So the Financial Times advert, worldwide, color, half page, what do you think the cost might be? Okay, so it's just over £32,000. Solus, which is one ad, one off, not a series of ads. And it's interesting because early in the week, I don't think anyone got particularly close to 32. Most students were considerably under the 32,000. So you can see it is expensive, and you probably wouldn't do one advert, you'd do a series over so many weeks. So that could run into potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds for a campaign. Okay, so how do we measure advertising rates? Well, first of all, we look at the size. Every newspaper is based on so many columns. So usually with tabloid, I think it's 7 columns. And to work out the price of an advert, first of all, we'll look at the height of the ad. So let's say, for example, it's 10 centimeters. That's the height. And then we look at the width, or how many columns is in the width. So let's say 2 columns. All right, so that's called a 10 by 2 advert. And then we need to use something called the SCC, or single column centimeter rate. So if the SCC rate is £100, the way we'd work that out would be 10 times by 2, then times by the SCC rate, which is 100, which means an advert would cost us £2,000 plus VAT. So every newspaper has a rate card, what's called a rate card, that includes different rates for different types of adverts. So this is an example of what an advert looks like for half a page, which is 7 columns. This is the SCC, single column centimeter rate, which is £119. So if we had an advert 17 by 7 columns, we then work that out by looking at the single column centimeter rate. Sorry, the single column centimeter rate, I should say, £295. So it's 119, 17 by 7, times by the SCC rate. So an advert like this would cost just over £35,000 for one particular advert. This is from the Independent. So again, we've got single column centimeter rate for display. There's a rate for color, mono, black and white, color. Specified position, so where you request a position on the a particular page and a position on the page. You'll notice that that's a little bit more than what we call run of paper. Run of paper means that you're not guaranteed and you don't know the position where your advert's going to go. That's at the discretion of the editor. All right, so depending on what's going into the paper on the day, it could be a very good position, such as inside front cover, or it could be on page 35 at the bottom of the page. So that's a little bit of a risk that you take, but you pay a lower rate for run of paper. Just some more examples of ads and sizes that you can have a look at in your own time. And then this is a task, so you can spend time and pause the video if you want to do this. So The task is you own a small independent organization that manufactures model aircraft. How do you know where to advertise your products? What are the questions you need to ask? All right, so think about some of the things I've talked about. If you want to advertise these, of course, you need to think about the media, but what are some of the key questions that you're going to ask? So you can pause the video and you can write these down. And these are just some of the questions. So what do we want to advertise? What type of aircraft product? When? Timing is important. If it's a new product, it might be seasonal and a run up to Christmas, for example. Again, the type of campaign, is it possibly a burst or drip? Think about target audience in terms of demographics, age, social class, socioeconomic scale. How much are we willing to spend? The other key question is, are we going to do advertising in-house or use the services of an agency? And finally, where should we advertise? So model aircraft, clearly it's quite niche. It's not going to appeal to everyone. So advertising in the Sun newspaper with 1.5 to 2 million readers, that's a large audience, but how many of those are actually going to want to buy a model aircraft? Probably quite a low figure. So what's a better option might be to advertise in a specialized magazine, such as something like Model Weekly, which might have a very low readership compared to the Sun newspaper. It could only have 30,000 readers, but out of that 30,000, the vast majority, of course, will be interested in model aircraft because they buy it and they subscribe to the publication. So targeting, okay, and target audience is really important. It's not just about circulation and readership. Okay, and then we're going to look at briefly how does print compare to other media. So this is from PAMC, which has data on different types of publications and reach by platform. So for popular news brands, so that would include the likes of popular daily newspapers like The Sun, for example, you can see that many of us getting our news on this mobile. Print is still it's still favourable to many, but mobile has seen quite a lot of growth when it comes to how we actually get our news. The same for quality news brands, so that would include the likes of the Times and Financial Times. And then we look at monthly magazines, and you can see the split here by reach. So we have what's called general monthlies and digital. There's no print because this is digital only. And again, mobile phone tends to be the main platform in terms of how we actually get our material from magazine brands. So let's have a look at some of the trends for print media. This is a little bit dated now, but it just gives you an indication of what's happened historically in terms of newspaper advertising expenditure year on year. And you'll see it's not good. There's a decline from 2010 through to 2015, a steady decline in advertising spend, and arguably that's to do with the internet and the growth of digital sites. Hence, that's why the Independent about 10 years ago moved to digital. This slide is much more detailed. It shows you here we've got different types of newspaper publications, and this is the circulation. So remember, circulation is the number of sales, not the number of people that read the publication. And unsurprisingly, The Sun, it remains actually as the most widely read newspaper in the UK, just under 1.5 million readers, all the way through to The Guardian, which is actually pretty low, I have to say, when compared to other publications, of about 138,000 circulation, more in terms of readers. The Guardian has, of course, moved to digital as well, so a lot of people get their news from The Guardian digitally, not in the hard copy format. Again, not a very good graph in the sense that, again, we've got a steady decline. The Daily Telegraph is seeing quite a significant decline, over 20%. If you know the readership, it's an older readership, so unfortunately it's a fact of life, but people die. The other thing about the Telegraph is that people are increasingly getting their news from elsewhere, and but again, it hasn't really developed or moved with the times in terms of how it delivers its news, and it's in a very, very competitive market, a very fragmented market now also, particularly in London. You know, it's competing with free publications like the Evening Standard as well. This table just shows us, again, a little bit dated, but you can see the trend here from 2007 to 2017. Different publications. What does it tell us? It tells us that there's a steady decline, not quite so significant when we look at TV type magazines like Radio Times, but specialist magazines like Saga, which is aimed at the 50+ market, has seen quite a significant decline based on Audit Bureau of Circulation figures. These figures are in thousands. So what we've got here is two niche publications. One is Angler's Mail and the other is Country Life. So Angler's Mail is aimed at those interested in fishing, and Country Life, if you're not familiar, it's quite an expensive glossy magazine that's aimed at those who are interested in rural Britain, perhaps live in the countryside, and it covers country pursuits, country fashion, country property. So the readership is quite high in terms of AB. What's interesting is that the monthly reach for print is high when compared to mobile, tablet, and desktop. Similarly, the same can be said when we look at sorry, this is C2DE. The same can be said when we look at ABC1 as well. It's significantly high. And I think that's largely to do with the type of demographic that reads the publication, why print is more popular. Reader's Digest for two different age groups here. Again, you'll see print is still still popular. For the younger age group, perhaps unsurprisingly, you know, phone is still, it's increasing in popularity. The same can be said in the 35+ age group. But I think what it tells us that print is by no means dead when we look at these publications. Okay, so again, perhaps to do in part with the audience, the target audience, but also the type of publication that it is. Another example is the magazine Mother and Baby. So here you can see the breakdown, looking at well, the total brand reach is 490,000, but if we look at the breakdown, you'll see that actually again, one would expect phone is popular, but also print. And I think the reason print is still popular is because, again, it's one of these magazines with high readership. So you'll find Mother and Baby in doctors' waiting rooms, at nursery groups, and that's why, you know, these type of organisations are buying the publication, and that's why the readership tends to be quite high. It's not just about circulation. The other thing as well, of course, is print media is becoming increasingly integrated with digital. So something like augmented reality can be used in conjunction with a print publication, as is the example here with this Sainsbury's magazine, and also for this car advert in this particular glossy magazine. So coming back to the question, is print media advertising dead? One argument might be, well, actually, no, it still has a place, perhaps depending on the type of publication and the type of demographics, and the fact that we can, you know, we can integrate different types of media, and we need to think about the mix as well, because print still appeals to a certain type of audience. So coming to the end of the presentation, just to illustrate my point, actually, there are print publications that have seen success and are actually growing. And this chart shows you from the first half of 2020, which is blue, to the first half of 2021, which is in grey. you can see that The Economist has seen growth, and some of these other publications have seen growth, particularly Private Eye, which is a political satirical magazine, has seen growth. Partly that might be to do with the pandemic. Perhaps people are reading more at home. They've got more time at home to read. But also in part it's to do with the type of audience that buy the publication. They have a preference perhaps for print media. And with something like The Economist as well, you know, it's bought by universities as a hard copy format. And again, the readership is quite high for something like The Economist. So I want you to have a think about this, coming back to the key question of the presentation. Is print media advertising dead? Now, I'd be looking for much more than a simple yes or no. If you think it is, or if you think it isn't, try to justify your answer. And I'll tell you what I think. So this is my view. I think print, clearly there has been a decline amongst national newspapers. However, it still has an audience for certain glossy magazines. Country Life magazine is a good example. Also for niche publications such as Private Eye, there's still a strong core audience that prefer print media. Private Eye has a little bit of digital content, but you can get very little online. Most of it is hard copy format. Advertising is not just about Instagram and Facebook. Print media can work well, as we saw earlier, in conjunction with something like augmented reality, or having an advert that has a reference to a social media site where there's a clear link from the print advert to digital. So it's about the mix. You know, how do we mix print and digital in terms of the communications mix? Think about the role. Think about the relationship between the two. Print ads in that respect can complement digital campaigns. And finally, I understand, I think you've covered drip with Tony Crisfield's drip model in class. Think about the purpose of the advertising. So for example, is it all about differentiation? Is the main focus all about persuasion? When we think about the drip model, that in turn might influence the type of media that we're going to use. So in short, I don't think print media advertising is dead. It's not great news in terms of newspapers, and that's evident from the fact that The Independent moved to digital about 10 years ago. But for these niche publications, that's the first key thing. And the second key thing is the role that it has as part of the mix. I think it still has a place. Okay, so thank you all very much. That's the end of the presentation. I will make sure that these slides go onto Blackboard. If you've got any questions, you're very welcome to email me, and do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.